In today's video, I will be going over the Restrap switch rack, in particular the direct mount version, along with the 10-litre switch panniers. Just to clarify, as always, this is not a sponsored video in any way. I purchased all my own gear, so when I do these videos, I can say exactly what the hell I like. The first thing I need to say is if you have been following this channel and the main channel, you will know I recently switched from using a seat post bag to a rear rack, the Aero rear rack, a rack that clamps to the seat stays. I would have happily continued using that rack as it worked perfectly for what I needed as a rider, but as both a rider and a filmmaker who is always trying to create better and better videos that showcase the real emotions and experiences that come along with bikepacking and human-powered adventures, my filming kit has evolved over time. I realised when I went away around Europe that these bigger trips would require me to take even more gear, batteries, editing equipment, hard drives, and everything else that comes with it. Normally, I'm fine with carrying a week or two's worth of camera gear in a small backpack, as it keeps the batteries warm for one, but when it came to carrying 3 months worth of gear, and all the editing side of stuff as well, it was simply getting a bit too much to carry this on my back. Unfortunately, I couldn't continue using the Aero rack because while I could add another cradle, the nature of how the bags attached to that rack would likely damage the more fragile camera and editing equipment I needed to carry for them longer adventures. So this is why I'm now going to be using the Restrap switch rack with two 10-litre switch panniers. While this video is not intended to be a full review, as I like to give the gear a real proper test over lots of adventures and time before giving my final thoughts, where you can really have a good look at how it's handled everything and how it's held up. This is going to be my first look and initial impressions. First, let's have a look at the rack and the installation process. This rack comes in two versions. The one I have here is the direct mount version, which uses the rack mounts already attached to your frame. If you don't have those, you can instead get this rack with through axle adapters. The version I have is the cheaper option at £107.99, although I did get a slight discount by signing up to Restrap's emails. And you won't need anything else to get this attached to your bike when you buy it. It comes with everything you need. Through axle version starts at £124.99 and comes with one through axle, which you will need to choose the correct thread pitch for your bike. If you are wanting to use that version on different bikes, you might need multiple through axle adapters, which does start pushing the price up a bit. Between my 3 bikes, I would have needed 3 separate through axle adapters. Luckily, all my bikes actually have rear rack mounts. Again, it comes with everything you need though to get it attached to your bike. The racks themselves are identical, the only difference is how they mount. Installing this rack was very easy and very straightforward, taking me about 5 minutes. The direct mount version comes with these little adapters which can be fitted in different orientations to accommodate different frame sizes. There is a handy diagram on Restrap's website that shows which way yours should go. From there, it's simply a case of using the correct length bolts and tightening everything up. The rack only bolts on the bottom near your dropouts. At the top, it simply attaches using a rubber-backed Velcro strap. You'll know it's correctly fitted when the top section of the rack sits horizontally over the rear wheel. Restrap have done their own installation video for both of these racks, so I'll link them in the video description if you need a more detailed video of getting this rack mounted to your bike. This rack isn't like a traditional rear rack. Rather than providing a large platform, it essentially adds more mounting points to your bike, much like fork mounts or bottle bosses. It relies on using accessories such as bags, fork cages, or other compatible equipment to actually carry anything. Restrap do sell a cradle for the rack, so you can attach a dry bag above the rear wheel like a traditional rack, although this costs an additional £40. This is really the only downside to racks like this, because they are modular they require an extra step before you can carry anything, whereas a traditional rear rack usually comes with a built-in top plate where you can just simply strap a cheap dry bag straight on. The reason I decided to go with this rather than a more traditional rack, and admittedly cheaper option, is because as my camera gear and editing equipment has grown, I needed a better way to just carry all of that, especially on the much longer tours that I want to continue making. So I needed to go back to using panniers. The problem with traditional panniers is that finding a small pair that simply hook onto a rack is actually quite difficult. To carry my winter kit, I need around 9 litres just for all my clothes, coat, sleeping bag, all that stuff. The smallest traditional pannier bag that I would trust on my adventures were still around 15 litres each, with most being 20 litres or more. They were simply just way too big for what I wanted. One of the downsides of panniers is that you really kind of need to put one on each side to balance the weight. I had very much hoped I could get away with using 2 Ortlieb 5.8 litre fork bags here, but after trying them, I simply could not get my winter kit and camera gear to fit between the two in a way I was happy with. So I have gone with the Restrap's 10 litre switch pannier system. Honestly, still a little on the big size really, but a slight bit of extra space isn't a bad thing. They also make these in a 5 litre version, so while 20 litres in total is honestly still more than I would like, it's the closest setup I've been able to find that carries everything I need, not just to ride these routes, but to film them as well. The pannier bags are fully waterproof, which is absolutely essential when carrying camera gear for me, and keeping all my sleeping gear and spare clothes dry. Probably more what you're looking for. They use a roll top closure, so as long as you can get 3 or more rolls, you can be confident your gear will stay dry. The bags are made from a waterproof outer with a seam sealed inner. The front of the outer uses a rougher material that is more resistant to scratches and scuffs, which will be typical while bikepacking, while the sides use a smoother material that is easier to wipe clean. The inside is a more traditional lightweight seam sealed dry bag. I do find that using 2 different materials on the outside makes rolling the bag down feel a little awkward and a little clunky. It doesn't roll quite as smooth as other dry bags I've used, but I think that's simply because everything is still a little bit stiff. Hopefully after some use that will improve over time as the fabric wears in. I'll certainly keep an eye on that and report back in the full review. Having multiple waterproof layers is nice though, because if the outer develops a hole, your gear should still stay dry until you can get it repaired, and Restrap do offer repairs. The bags attach to the rack using the hip lock and Restrap switch mounting system. Essentially there is a mount that bolts directly onto the rack using 2 bolts, very similar to bottle cage mounts on your bike. These just stay on the rack permanently. You can also use these bags on a fork if you have fork mounts, although you will usually be limited to around 3 kilograms unless your fork is rated for more. On the switch rack itself, however, these bags are rated up to 10 kilograms, which I think you'd probably have to fill with water or bricks to actually reach in a 10 litre size bag. On the outside of the bag is the mounting plate that slides into the mount attached to the rack. You'll know this is properly attached because there is this very satisfying click when completed. It's not impossible to slide it in slightly crooked though, so it does take a little bit of practice. To remove the bag, there is a small tab that you press down before sliding it back out. So far, apart from forgetting exactly where to press a few times, it seems to work exactly as intended. I am particularly interested to see how these mounts perform after plenty of muddy rides though. I have a very similar mounting system on an inflatable kayak for the skeg, and once the sand and grit get inside, it becomes an absolute nightmare to remove. So I'm hoping this system manages dirt a little better than that after spending plenty of time off-road. But I will report back in a future video. I will of course come back and do a full review on this setup after I've spent some real time with it on proper adventures. For now, my initial thoughts are very positive. The rack feels solid, well built, and riding the bike with nothing loaded, it's minimal and literally weighs practically nothing, or get in the way of anything. It will just live on the bike even when not bikepacking. Once I added the bags, everything still felt very secure, with no noticeable sway or movement. Off-road, with the panniers nice and low, I continued to feel like I was in control. Depending on how much weight is in the bags, if they're on the lighter side, I did notice a very slight rattly type feeling, but nothing particularly concerning. Once weighted down, I didn't notice any of that though. The only real downside I would mention at this stage is the price. Because this rack sits in quite a niche market compared to a traditional rear rack, it's always going to be harder to justify. The rack isn't bad value, but when you add the bags, perhaps a cradle, it starts getting very pricey. Even the cheaper direct mount version is probably around twice the price of an equivalent quality traditional rack. However, when you compare it with similar modular systems, it is priced quite similar, or even cheaper than many alternatives. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that's worth it, but throughout this first look, I'll be focusing purely on how well it functions. There's already one thing I know I don't like, and to be honest, this is one of the reasons I think pannier systems just aren't as popular for off-road riding, and it's whenever you have to push the bike during hiker bike sections, the bags do kind of get in the way. I'm sure this is something I'll adapt to over time by changing how I position myself while pushing the bike, but it's worth mentioning just in case you didn't realise that having bags hanging beside the bike creates a wider bike, and walking beside it, you might find yourself kicking it a bit. Same with going through narrow obstacles. You'll need to learn to remember the bike is now a bit wider with a pannier setup. The same goes for pulling away from a standing start. I've already managed to kick the bags multiple times. So that's my first look at the Restrap switch rack, direct mount and a 10-litre switch panniers. This is how I'll be carrying all my camera gear and spare clothes, sleeping bag and anything else that absolutely needs to stay dry. I'll come back once I've lived with this setup for a while and take a proper look at how it is held up in real world conditions at a later date.